This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for watching this week's NC Spin. Halloween came and went, and Tuesday's coming. Today we will at long last get the report card on the winners and losers in this year's midterm elections. Count on us to give you the last word, especially in legislative and local elections. But the big story this past week was President Margaret Spelling's announcement she's leaving UNC. Why now? And who might replace her? We've got it all covered for you on this week's NC Spin with a great panel. And speaking of them, let me introduce them to you. Rick Henderson, Editor-in-Chief of the Carolina Journal, Chris Fitzsimon, Senior Political Analyst, John Hood, Syndicated Columnist and author, and Brad Crone, Political and Communications Consultant. We begin our uninterrupted debate after these brief messages by our underwriters.
In rural North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
Before we begin this week's show, we need to note that Becky Gray, one of our panelists, regular panelist on this show, lost her mother this past week. And all of the NC Spin family, and I'm sure a lot of you who are our regular viewers, want to express our condolences and sympathies for Becky and her family during this time of loss. Well, let's get started. Only 3 years in office, and Margaret Spelling's announced she's leaving the presidency of UNC. We want our panel to discuss what may have prompted this decision and Dr. Bill Roper's appointment to take her place on an interim basis. Rick Henderson, it's been no secret that behind closed doors, the relationships between the Board of Governors and between the Board of Governors and President Spelling have been tense. Most people speculated President Spellings would probably fulfill her 5-year contract and then leave and go back to Texas, but she announced she's going to be leaving March 1st. What are you hearing about why Spellings is leaving?
She's getting out while the getting is good, I think, is what's happening from what I can tell. She's actually leaving before March 1st, although she will be paid through March 1st, and that's part of a buyout clause, if you will, in her contract. What she's doing is she's leaving because the tensions are so great. There's a lot of pressure on her to make personnel moves, perhaps at some of the university campuses that she may not be very comfortable with. And let's get this straight. She works for the board, but the board itself seems to be very fractured right now, and all the happy talk about unity on the board is just basically window dressing.
Brad, we understand there have been shouting matches inside the boardroom, even though they may be closed-door sessions.
And this has been foreshadowed really since the summer, the escalation of the tension between the board. And Rick's correct, you have ongoing factions within the Board of Governors where you've got deviance between certain groups and what they want. It will be intriguing to watch the university politics as they move forward on picking a final selection. The Roper appointment is a caretaker. The question is going to be, will they look at Roper permanently?
Is it a caretaker, John? We're hearing that he's left the door open and might decide, and they might decide this could be permanent.
Well, it's obvious that the door is open. I mean, there were attempts to get someone to close the door, and no one closed the door to Bill Roper being the permanent president. On the other hand, I don't believe that decision has been made. I simply believe it is a possibility. And why is it a possibility? Because it may be difficult for the Board of Governors to come to a conclusion about an alternative candidate.
Well, not only that, but it might be difficult to get respected educators particularly those who have some North Carolina connection to want to take that job, Chris.
Well, I think so. With all the rancor that is obviously there, anybody with the credibility and the sort of gravitas to come into this job in the first place would do their own research before they took the job, and I think they would find it sort of a dysfunctional board. It's also worth remembering, especially the Senate leadership did not want Margaret Spellings to get this job in the first place. They had another candidate in mind. The board chair, the board and the selection committee decided to hire Margaret Spellings, and several members of the selection committee were not reelected by the state Senate when they were up for election. So this thing has its roots actually in the reformation of the board. Add to that the tension that Brad and others have described that started last summer.
Let's go even further. You're absolutely correct, and the candidate was Peter Hans, who's now the president of the community college system, and I believe that Peter will be another finalized candidate. And what could be, I believe Peter has the potential to be truly a great consensus builder if they would look at putting him in charge and give him the opportunity to lead the university
system. Well, that's the question, Rick. Are they going to let anybody be in charge?
Well, that is the big question, is that there are issues about the different factions which have different goals, and they change sometimes from week to week. Is there going to be someone there who will be willing to be a unifier and who will be willing to say, okay, I work for you guys, but let's get on the same page. Let's get a mission together and not just simply be somebody who just stands out in front while they do everything behind the scenes.
Most of you guys remember when we celebrated our 600th edition of NC Spin Show, and we did a long-form interview with Bill Friday, probably the last long-form interview he did before he died. And he told us then that back in 1971, when all of this was coming about, he argued vociferously with Bob Scott, who was then governor of North Carolina, about this process of how these governors were going to be nominated and selected. And he was vehemently opposed to having the legislature name them. And I wonder what the good Dr. Friday might be saying today, John.
Well, first he'd correct you and say, call him Mr. Friday.
Yes.
But what I think Mr. Friday said and what others have said is that this is a system that is very different from the way we staff other major governance boards. It's strikingly different even from the community college board, obviously from State Board of Education, and I think some rethinking of this entire process is necessary. I'm just not sure how likely it would be.
This is the only organization in North Carolina, as I remember, that reports directly to the legislature. Is that correct?
Well, who's all elected by the legislature. The
Yeah.
governor has no appointments, right? And I think the legislature bears some responsibility in the rancor. As I mentioned, they were very angry that their candidate wasn't selected. I think that sort of kicked off what has now mushroomed into a dysfunctional board.
There are lots of moving parts to this story, and there's lots that can be told and hasn't been told, but we will do so in another couple of weeks because we need to get on to this week's election. Since the beginning of January, the political pundits have been talking about this year's midterms, but there's been distractions aplenty, including controversies in Washington and hurricanes in our own state. We want to give you the last word on the vote, especially legislative and local elections. Brad, more than 1,700,000 people have cast ballots in early voting, surpassing all previous midterm elections. Democrats and women are leading the surge. Tell us what this means and what factors are impacting this large turnout.
It means poll workers and campaign consultants are real tired right now. Tom, I think it shows both sides are really energized. The bases seem to be performing. I don't think it's fair to take any type of abstract data and say this is what's going on because you're just ladling one cup of soup over to the other cup of soup. It all depends on what type of same-day vote turnout you have. If there is one particular abstract data that's interesting to me, and that's performance of unaffiliated voters. And we'll see how they do on Election Day, but they are the block that's going to decide who governs North Carolina.
Rick, as might have been expected, this past week we were inundated by polls that have been taken. Spectrum had a poll that came out. Meredith College had a poll that came out. Civitas had a poll that came out. We've been saying all along not to pay a heck of a lot of attention to these polls, but now it's getting down to the time when shouldn't we be paying attention to what they say, and are they consistent?
Well, there's some consistency going on. The thing that people should pay attention to is, are the polls looking at likely voters and when were they taken? And the poll that was taken, for instance, by Margaret at the college is a poll that has some issues by, for one thing, only dealing with the registered voters, and it was taken while early voting was going on.
Right.
So it oversampled millennials by a large margin, and that's a real problem because millennials don't vote in very large shares. The thing that the poll that came out of Spectrum that we'll talk about, of course, when it comes down to the constitutional amendments, found those amendments, several of them, in a lot of trouble or barely passing, if at all, and that's one that is worth looking at very closely.
All right, so let's get into some of these races. And folks, from time to time, I know that when you watch the show, you're sitting there saying, why are you getting in the weeds with all of these individual legislative races across the state? And the answer to that is that nobody else does this. And so if we may not happen to be talking about your particular legislative district, hang in there with us if you don't mind, because I think that there is some significance and importance to it. So let's look at the House races first. The House has a 75-45 plurality. The Democrats need to win 4 seats in order to break the veto-proof supermajority. They need 16 to flip the House. When we finish with this, I'm going to ask your expectations on this, but let's talk about some seats. John, let's talk about House Seat 1 up in the northeastern part of the state. That was the seat Bob Steinberg vacated.
Correct, and that's a swing area. People are used to thinking of swing districts as being suburban, and the rural areas have now become all red. That's not true. This is an area of lots of different counties merged into a district. Ed Goodwin is the Republican nominee against Ron Wesson, the Democrat. Very competitive race.
All right, moving over right beside that, House District 2. Brad, we got Larry Yarborough, who's a Republican incumbent against Darrell Moss.
Yeah. Race running against the mayor of Creedmoor, Darrell Moss, a true nail-biter there. I've heard internally the numbers look good for Yarborough, but I think it's going to be a very close contested election.
Chris, moving down the list, House District 6, Tess Judge, Republican incumbent running against Bobby Hanning.
Well, no, this is an interesting one. This is actually Beverly Boswell, was a Republican incumbent who was sort of the more conservative candidate, lost a primary to Bobby Hanning, who's was on the county commission, who's more of a sort of a slightly more moderate Republican. This is a really interesting race, whether the Republican base is energized enough because they sort of lost their sort of hard right candidate. I think this is going to go down to the wire.
One of the things that you'll note as we go through this is that the larger urban counties in North Carolina, Mecklenburg, New Hanover, Wake, all of these larger counties have some very contested races. New Hanover has a couple of them.
There are 3 races in New Hanover that are really interesting. 2 House races, House District 19 and 20, Ted Davis and Holly Grange. Ted Davis running against Marshy Morgan, and Holly Grange is Leslie Cohen. The state Senate race there is Mike Lee facing Harper Peterson, the former mayor of Wilmington. All of them are super competitive. The Democrats have dumped a boatload of money into New Hanover County, and they're feeling pretty confident about it.
This is an area where the storm, of course, might affect the outcome.
The outcome of the vote total.
Yeah.
Good point to note. Moving over to House 22, this is Bladen County. William Brisson's running against Denning. Handicap that for us real quick.
Well, Brisson is a Republican who was a Democrat who caucused with the Republicans and changed his registration. This is the first time he's running as a Republican, and Denning is making an issue out of that, basically, that he changed teams on them, and it looks like a real tight race.
John, let's get into Wake County. We talked about Wake County. We got Chris Malone, Nelson Dollar, John Adcock, and Joe John in very hotly contested races. Handicap those, 35, 36, 37
and 40. And the first 3 that you mentioned, which would be Malone, Dollar, and Adcock, are Republicans, and then Joe John in House District 40 is the Democrat who defeated the former representative there, Republican Marilyn Avila. That's a rematch from 2 years ago. It's particularly noticeable in at least 2 of those races, Malone and Dollar. You've got the State Employees Association working for the Republican incumbents against the Democratic challengers. Not the case in 37. So obviously Wake County is the strongest concentration of state employee voters.
And Wake County has had a very large early vote turnout, which could obviously...
The key point there is Nelson Dollar's the senior approach chair on the House side. So if he loses, they'll be changing leadership if the Republicans hold on to power.
Yeah. All right. So, Chris, let's move over to Sanford, Harnett, and Lee County. We've got John Saul's very, very strongly contested with Lisa Mathis. This was a district that was redrawn.
Right, it was, and this is the ones you talk to Democrats, and they'll tell you this is the top of the second tier. There's a few they're fairly confident of winning. This is the beginning of that next set where they think if they're going to have a really big year, they have to have this one. It's very close. The ads have gotten really, as in many races, sort of mean in the last couple days before the election. This will go down to the wire. All
right, so moving over to House District 66. Ken Goodman has been in charge of a group called Main Street Democrats. Brad, I know we got to disclose. You work for him. You account for him. But he is an incumbent running against Joey Davis, and there's some talk this seat could flip.
It is. It's a Republican-leaning seat. It's 55% Republican performance district. Ken's had to go in and really work the retail politics of it, and it's going to be an election. It's a swing election, and it's one race that you'll have to watch.
Let's move up to the mountains of North Carolina, Rick. We got Ashland-Watauga County. Jonathan Jordan's running against Ray Russell.
Jonathan Jordan's always had difficulties winning election, and in this particular case, Ray Russell is running very strongly as a pro-public education establishment candidate, arguing that Jonathan Jordan is not for teachers and the like, and so the issue of education spending is key in that particular district.
See how NCAE turns out for him.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, all right. Let's get back into some of the more urban areas, going in the Mecklenburg area. We got 98, 103, 104, and 105, John Bradford, Bill Brawley, Andy Doolin, and Scott Stone. Talk about those.
These are all four Republican incumbents facing Democratic challengers. I think that Bradford is probably the least challenged in that race. The other three I'll mention very quickly. Bill Brawley's opponent is Rachel Hunt, the daughter of former North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt.
And there's been tons of money poured into
It's a very expensive race, and in a district that typically performs Republican. Andy Doolin and Scott Stone are both, again, from traditionally Republican areas, but an area. This is obviously a place where a turnout of independents who are kicking towards the Democrats, or even maybe some suburban Republican-leaning voters who may be not quite performing it the same way this year. That's where these Mecklenburg races are particularly that narrative.
All right, let's get back to 115. We got John Ager running there against Amy Evans.
Yeah, Ager has been there. He had a real tough election the last time around. Evans is running a very strong campaign, and again, the issue is healthcare education.
All right, Chris, in Haywood County, Mike Clampett and Josanne Quinn.
Right. This has been one of the. We talk about this election every year, every 2 years.
We could just, put those down in.
In some ways, you could argue that these are the ones that whoever's having the good year, the Democratic year, maybe Josanne Queen wins by a nose. Clampett won when it was a Republican year. This is one of those you'll know when this race is decided, you'll know what sort of year it was.
And see the trend lines develop.
That's exactly right.
All right, so we said before 75-45 Republicans to Democrats. They need to flip 6 seats in order to get rid of the veto-proof majority. 13 seats to take control of the House very quickly. Let me go around the table. How likely are either of those scenarios, John?
I think it's unlikely the Democrats will take control of the House. I think it is fairly likely that they will break the supermajority. I think that the Republicans will end up in the high 60s.
All right. Brad?
65-35 Republican majority. Democrats pick up 10 seats.
All right. So they break the supermajority.
They break the supermajority.
Rick? Same thing. Yeah, they break the supermajority, but they don't take control.
Chris?
I think the most likely scenario is 8 to 10 Democratic seats. There's an outside chance in some of these ones. It could be 12 to 13. That would be I think the best the Democrats could hope for.
Well, that would flip the control of the House.
Well, no, it wouldn't. It would be just close. It would be close.
Okay.
Right.
All right. Let's move over to the Senate, because we want to talk about some of those Senate seats. They're very interesting also. The first one, Rick, is Bob Steinberg moving over from the House and running against Cole Phillips up in the Northeast.
Cole Phelps. This was a race. Steinberg left the House, is moving to the Senate. He's somebody who has run has been a very contentious person throughout his tenure in the General Assembly. Cole Phelps is 29 years old, and so this is an interesting race.
All right.
And it's a Democratic performing district, has been since Mark Bass night, but the Democrats haven't been able to win the thing since 2010.
Let's go over to Senate Seat 7. This is Lewis Pate's incumbent seat, running against David Brantley. They talk like it's close.
Well, it might be close. Brantley is a retired Chief District Court Judge. Lewis Pate's a well-known incumbent who's had some health issues late in the campaign. I think it would have to be a fairly big big Democratic year for this to swing, but it's not impossible.
Brad talked about the Michael Lee Harper-Peterson race, so we won't do that again. But let's move over to Wake County, John. We've got two really hot ones there. In 17 and 18, Tamara Barringer is running against Sam Searcy as an incumbent. Tamara, according to polls, is up slightly, but it's close. And then we get over to Johnny Mac Alexander running against Mac Paul. That's the one people are watching.
Well, they are. Both races are competitive. I have talked to people on both sides. Both sides are fairly confident. So somebody's mistaken. but this is a competitive, very competitive race, and a race that has been dominated by mailers and issues that have not been sort of general interest issues, but specific to the candidates.
And pointed and ugly.
How dare they? It's politics.
Yeah, that's right. Over in Senate 19, Chris, Wesley Meredith running against Kirk Deviere. I like pronouncing that name.
You did that very well.
Yeah, well, all right.
This one has gotten extremely heated. I think this will be one of the closer Senate races in the state, and it may end up being the nastiest one if we could see all the mailers.
All right, got to go up to the Winston-Salem, the Triad area. Trudy Wade's seat up there, running against Michael Garrett.
Yeah, the thing with Trudy Wade is that she was embattled. We had some issues with redistricting up there, and she's going to have a tough time taking that one again.
She's actually running an ad about immigration policy, which strikes a lot of people odd. A member of the General Assembly is worried about the caravan.
And we're seeing some more of those national issues being brought into these legislative races.
And over in Mecklenburg, we talked earlier about Mecklenburg, but in Mecklenburg County, Jeff Tart's seat being contested by Natasha Marcus.
This will be the one that if the Democrats think they're going to pick up a Senate seat, this would be the one that they think they can win. If they don't win the Senate seat, I'm not sure they may not win a Senate seat.
All right, 35-15, the current margin there. Give me your predictions as to what's going to happen. Can the Democrats overcome the veto-proof majority, or can they take control of the Senate, John?
I think in this case the Democrats will fall short of taking out the supermajority of the Republicans. I would see it more in the range of about a 3-seat gain, maybe 4.
All right, Brad?
I agree with John. I think it's a 3-seat, 4-seat.
Rick?
Yeah, I think 32-18 sounds about right to me.
I think it's going to be very difficult to break the veto-proof majority. If they do, this will have to be a massive Democratic wave, and somebody who we haven't even talked about will have to lose.
Yeah. Let's move into the congressional races. We've talked about them quite a bit through the weeks, and so I don't want to spend too much time on them. But we got 3 competitive congressional races going on in North Carolina. 2nd District, 9th District, 13th District. 2nd District, we got Linda Coleman running against incumbent George Holding. We've heard this polling-wise was narrowly ahead with Holding or Coleman. It's flipped back and forth. Late last week, it was reported by Civitas that Holding was ahead by a fairly good margin.
I think that it's fair to say the Republicans were very nervous about this race a couple of weeks ago. They're feeling more confident about it, but cautiously optimistic.
Over in the 13th, we've got first-term Ted Budd, incumbent Republican, running against Kathy Manning. That's been a showcase race.
I think this actually might be closer than people think. Budd's recently trumpeting, no pun intended, his close ties to President Trump. I think in the suburban voters, that probably cuts both ways. I'm not sure the Democrats are going to win. This will be Critics Congress. They have a shot at this one.
This is a cultural crop.
Yeah,
right, absolutely.
People are saying, Brad, that if Democrats have a chance to flip the House in Congress, they got to take House District 9. Mark Harris and
it's extremely competitive. The last few weeks, I think McGrady's climbed back. He had lost some ground after the Kavanaugh bump. Is going to be extremely competitive. I don't see any of the Democrats winning any of these races, though.
I got 2 minutes left in show, guys, so I want to try to cover as much time as I possibly can. First of all, the Supreme Court race with incumbent Barbara Jackson, Chris Anglin, and Anita Earls. Most everybody agrees Earls going to take this. Any argument there?
If Republicans voted for the Republican candidate, I think she might have a chance of winning Barbara Jackson, but that's not the situation.
All right, how about these other seats? We got John Arrowwood running. Having been appointed, what's that looking like?
I think Andrew Heath has a very good shot. He's the Republican candidate against Arrowwood of winning that particular seat because it's just 2 people running.
All right, we got 2 other open seats. Jefferson Griffin is running as a Republican in one of them, Wake District Judge. GOP has endorsed him. Then you've got Sandra Ray and Toby Hampson
Hampson's the Democrat. Ray's
a lot of people
Ray is
have been
another
another Republican.
Republican
This
that
is the
could
problem.
split it up.
Yeah.
Entering the primary has really come back to haunt the
The third
legislative
seat, we
Republicans.
got Allegra Collins, a Democrat, running against Chuck Kitchen. And then we've got a Libertarian, Michael Monaco, running in that. Any handicapping?
I think the Republican campaign there's really cooking.
I think Allegra Collins actually has gotten a lot of money and is going to win that race.
All right, we mentioned before the fact that the Spectrum poll this past week showed that there were a couple of these amendments underwater. Right. I got 1 minute left in show. The two amendments they're talking about underwater are the judicial appointment and the Board of Elections.
They're very difficult to explain and understand, and that's probably why they're going to lose.
If you don't know, vote no.
That's right.
That's what a lot of people are
in that
saying.
poll to me was that lowering the tax gap was close. I think that is a very interesting finding when you would think normally that would be sort of appeal to people who didn't really get it, whether you agree with it or not. I think that is pretty interesting.
So it looks like there will be at least 4 of them that are going to pass.
3 will pass.
Three will
almost
pass.
Certainly,
Right.
one of
Okay.
them is a question mark. The other 2 are harder.
A lot to cover. You've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, give your feedback, and read my column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch us on Facebook. And join us next week when we will tell you what happened and how. And we'll have more balanced debate for the Old North State. Until then, stay informed and watch out for the spin.
In rural North Carolina, vibrant main streets depend on a thriving agricultural economy. Research at NC State improves the products our farmers raise and grow. NC State Extension brings that research from labs to fields in all 100 counties, which means growth for rural North Carolina. At NC State, what we think and do helps grow local economies. Discover how NC State and Extension work for you. Visit wegrownc.ncsu.edu.
Production underwriting support provided in part by the more than 65,000 members of the North Carolina Retired Governmental Employees Association.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.